this is always categorized as a genre or a subgenre, and I've always labeled it that way as well. It wasn't until like I started prepping for this podcast earlier today, I'm like, and I'm thinking the same dilemma we had when we were talking about film noir, where it's just like, well, people try to include all these other films, these crime films that weren't technically film noirs. And I see movies like Coolie High. Coolie High is a drama. It's not just because it's a black cast. It's not a blaxploitation. And it made me realize like film noir and blaxploitation, they're more film movements that are synonymous with a time and a place rather than a genre that you can continue like implementing films in. Because much like film noir, where you have mystery, you have detective films. Those are the subgenres within that crime genre that those film noir films are, and it's the same thing with this. With like, blaxploitation covers a ton of genres and subgenres. Actually, I think most of them are action and crime, and I think, at least in my opinion, I wasn't, I'm old, but I'm not that old to know when these movies actually came out. But I think part of that is you had like a black community that wanted to see black heroes on screen. And when I thought about it, it was almost like Black Panther, where you had all these Marvel movies that's taking everyone by storm and they're so popular. And then when Black Panther came out, it was just like this huge thing. It was like, oh my God, now we have a black superhero. And I think that's kind of what Shaft was when it came out in 71. I think it was the one in 1970, Cotton Comes to Harlem, that was technically the first, but it didn't really propel the movement. It was more so that fit into what the movement became. Seeing Shaft, I think, on the big screen really made black people think, oh my God, like, yeah, that guy's like, he's like James Bond. He's like Captain Kirk. He's the hero that like always gets the last line, the coolest guy in the room, gets the girl, wisecracks the bad guy. That's the guy, I want to be like him. The girls want him. And I think that's kind of what those action hero stars ended up becoming, and there were a ton of them. Richard Roundtree would not be like synonymous with the action hero, even though he was the first. There were several that we'll get into later, I'm sure. And I think the other one was the crime films, because there's obviously a lot of crime in the black community. There's a lot of reasons for it: over policing, under policing, which both can lead to a lot of crime, and also less opportunities for blacks, especially at that time. So it was disproportionate how poor blacks were. And a lot of these films really took place in the inner city, in just a couple of cities, most of it Harlem. So I think those were the two genres that really stuck out.
Well, I heard somebody say that film noir isn't so much a genre as it is a style. And for the very reason you said, that there's all kinds of different movies that fit into film noir, like westerns, comedies, romances, whatever. And I think the same could be said for blaxploitation, that it does have a lot of different genres within that. There are horror films, there are dramas, as you said. But I do think that probably the action and crime films were the main category of blaxploitation. When we think about blaxploitation, that's really what we're thinking about. And probably that's the case for noir as well. We're really thinking about crime films, not so much westerns or anything else, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, it is blaxploitation. So you're talking about two different things. And there is some irony with it as well, in that this was supposed to be a movement, if we're going to go with that, that was supposed to show blacks being independent, standing up for themselves, taking it to the man, And ironically, a lot of the people behind the scenes that were really pushing these movies, getting them out there, were white. Producers, all the money men, the people that really set their genre and capitalized it were white. They put the black people in front of the screens, but they were the real money men behind it. And as much as this movement helped to give Black actors and talent and opportunity in the 70s, which is really when most of this took place, once the 70s were over, when you look before the 70s and after the 70s, we look in the 60s and 80s moving on, until you had like filmmakers like John Singleton and Spike Lee in the late 80s, early 90s, they went back to being the sidekicks and the criminals and the antagonists right after. So it's kind of weird in that what they were all about before and after, and even during, it really was just all fantasy, which is kind of depressing when you think about it in that way. But yeah, I mean, the money men were white and they had the opportunity in this short space of time to be like stars. But Pam Grier, she didn't do much. I mean, she was huge. She was, you talk about like Jamie Lee Curtis, the Scream Queen, and certain like Julia Roberts is synonymous with romantic comedies. Well, Pam Grier, she was the queen of Blaxploitation, and she was, I mean, she's as beautiful. I'm sorry, I know Julia Roberts is a beautiful woman, and Jamie Lee Curtis. Pam Grier in her prime was as beautiful as a woman can get, and she didn't really get any real work after that. I mean, she got some bit parts. I think she was in the Seagal movie. Obviously, Jackie Brown was her big comeback with Quentin Tarantino, and then she did some work after that. But yeah, like the biggest stars in this genre really didn't get a lot of work.
That's true. I was always surprised that Pam Grier didn't do better after sort of the four big movies that we think of her starring in. She really did kind of go into supporting roles and stuff like that. So yeah, I was surprised.
These films, there were a lot of the films that really leaned into the exploitation part of the blaxploitation, like Blackula, Blackenstein, Black Caesar, which I think it's like a takeoff of Little Caesar. And I think it was supposed to star Sammy Davis Jr., but that fell through. Abby, which is a take on The Exorcist. Black Mama, White Mama, which was a take on the Defiant Ones. These were all like very Black Shampoo, which is a take on Shampoo. I could go on and on, but these are all takes on obviously, popular films. And oh, here's a Blackenstein version of Frankenstein. It's like very dead on and very quick, cheap movies meant to just like churn out, almost like, just a quick buck. But here's someone Black starring in a Black version of a movie you've already heard of. It's already a property that you're familiar with, and here's a Black version of it. And those are cool, and you can like those ironically or tongue in cheek or maybe genuinely. But for me, I tend to lean towards liking the ones that are kind of artistic, the people who took the staples and the things that made Blaxploitation what it was, and actually tried to say something within that genre. And I do have a list of films that I think are good recommendations for people who like that stuff or maybe like the cheesier stuff. And I'll share that list, and I like your feedback and films you think maybe belong on there that you would add to that as well. So for me, these aren't like what I think are the 10 best, because that's just giving you my opinion, and that's not really helpful to a viewer looking to get into it. It's just my opinion on it. So these I think are the most important ones and the most they're important, and they're also they're a good introduction to it as well. If you don't know a lot about the genre, if you know a lot about it, then you have your own opinion, and you can pick your own films. But for me, Ganja and Hess, and these are in no particular order, because again, this is just recommendations. It's not like my favorite top 10 from 10 to 1. Ganja and Hess, which is kind of an artistic version of the Dracula take. It's very artistic. I honestly, when I first watched it, it wasn't an easy watch for me because I didn't know where it was going. I'm like, all right, where are the vampires? It's like it's more like a vampire than like a Nosferatu. But it's really cool, and I like it, and I think it's a good introduction for someone looking for a little bit more than just schlock. And a counterpart to that, I think, would be Blackula, which is very much schlock, but it's really entertaining schlock. And I love that. I watched that movie a ton of times as a kid, you know, on repeat before cable or anything like that. Any thoughts on either of those?
Oh yeah, they're both great movies. And Ganja and Hess, that's almost an art house film. It's like a very artistic and serious film in a way. It's almost not exploitation at all. And it stars Dwayne Jones, who most people know from Night of the Living Dead. And I think he didn't make very many films at all. He sort of retired and taught. I think he taught acting, but he didn't do a whole lot of acting. But those are really the two essential Dwayne Jones films, I think, Night of the Living Dead and Ganja and Hess. If you see the uncut version, it's quite long. It's a very long movie, but it was butchered, I think, when it was released originally, or at some point. I think there were different versions on video that you could get that were severely cut, and they gave it names like Black Vampire, or, you know, stupid names like that that just didn't really do justice to the movie. So I was glad to finally get to see the uncut version as it was meant to be seen. And I agree, it's not an easy film. It's not necessarily for everybody, but it's a very good film for people who appreciate more serious and artistic films. Blackula is just good fun. That's a really, I love that movie.
Number two on my list is Coffee. And again, I already mentioned Pam Grier. She is the queen of the genre. Pam Grier in her prime is a bad bitch. She is just gorgeous and bad, not just looking good, but she was like a really powerful Black woman. And this was a time where you can have a powerful Black woman on screen, or just a powerful woman on screen, where it wasn't divisive. I think right now our culture is very divisive. And like the minute you see something like, if something like this came out today, it'd be super polarizing. You have a movie like Captain Marvel, which was very divisive for a Marvel fan base, because it was like, it felt like it was pushing this female agenda of like female empowerment. And this was something that was organic. It's like, it wasn't force fed. You didn't feel like, oh, you're just trying to gender swap, like instead of a badass like Shaft, you're just giving us Pam Grier. No, Pam Grier was a badass. You believed she was a badass, and you wanted her in that role. And I think she's great for women who are looking for like a female, especially a Black woman. If you're looking for like someone, oh my gosh, like, oh, I can emulate that. She did that. I can do that. I can, you know, the same way people feel about Black Panther, they can feel that same way about watching Pam Grier, not just as an actress, but just like a powerful Black woman on screen, in a very non-divisive way, in a very badass way. And she made a lot of great films. My personal preference is Coffee. That's why it's on the list. But you also have like Foxy Brown, Black Mama, White Mama, a ton of other Blaxploitation, and then even more just flat out exploitation films that she made throughout the 70s.
Absolutely. Pam Grier is awesome, and Coffee is an awesome movie. It's, I think the opening sequence of Coffee has to be one of the greatest opening sequences of all time. It's, and it's rough and it's raw, you know, it's like really violent. It's unexpected. It really catches you off guard how violent it really is. And obviously it was the first one that she made with Jack Hill, and Foxy Brown sort of came later. And to me, that one looks a lot slicker. It looks like it had a bigger budget. Jack Hill kind of denies that. He says it's the same budget, but I find that hard to believe, because Coffee just seems so raw and grungy somehow to me. I don't know if you feel that way.
Absolutely. That's why I have it on my list over Foxy Brown.
Yeah.
Foxy Brown feels too polished. And it doesn't have the rawness that I look for. When I look at Blaxploitation films, I want to feel like I'm on the streets with these people, you know? I want to feel like they're doing real drugs, and this is a documentary, it's not a movie. Because that's the feel that some of these movies have, because they're on location. They're like real people, non-actors in some of these roles. And Coffee gives you that feel. It feels genuine, it feels authentic. Foxy Brown feels like a movie. And part of that too is it is more polished. Budget aside, I mean, obviously we don't know for sure, but budget aside, it just feels more polished. It feels more like a movie. And I think part of that is because it was supposed to be a sequel, I think.
Hmm.
It was supposed to be a follow-up. It was like almost like a soft reboot because it follows a lot of the same beats as well. But yeah, I prefer it over Foxy Brown. That's why it's on the list. These are in no particular order, but the third one I have here is Across 110th Street. Again, absolute classic. I love this because of the cast is just impeccable. The acting, again, I love blaxploitation films, but acting is generally not at the top of the list in these movies because I just said before with the previous film, you have a lot of non-actors, a lot of black actors that didn't really have a lot of opportunities, so they're kind of honing their skills in these films as well. And it's low budget, very quickly done, as we spoke about before. These are just exploitation films. I mean, they're blaxploitation, but exploitation is a big part of that word. And they're made to be done very quickly in a few weeks and just get it out there to capitalize on whatever you're piggybacking off of that's popular at the time, or just to get it out in theaters. So to see something that has the level of acting, and the actors in this movies went on to do good, great things as well. And also, there was a craft to it. There were so many inventive shots, and just like, man, you took your time with this setup. You didn't just set up the camera, blast the lights, and said action. Like, you set these shots up, and you were thinking. Like, it was great shot composition, good pacing, and it said something. It said a lot about race relations, and it felt like it had a message, and I was all for it. This is one of my favorite films, period, even outside blaxploitation.
Yeah, it's a great movie for sure. And I would say it feels much more like a movie than, say, Coffee. It feels more like they had a bit more of a budget or a bit more time, like you're saying. And yeah, it's very good. It's a very good movie. I like that one a lot too.
Next up, we have The Spook Who Sat by the Door. This is a very obscure one. Not a lot of people have heard of it. I think it's also based on a book. And I would say what Fight Club is to masculinity, The Spook Who Sat by the Door is to race relations with blacks and whites. It's very subversive in its message and how it plays out. And it has all of that conspiracy theories, like people pulling the strings. It has a lot of that stuff in there. And it's thoroughly entertaining, it's thought provoking. And again, if I had to parallel it with something that's common and popular now, I would say it's kind of like that Fight Club type thing where it's just like, you know, you have these people trying to bring down a society, and here it's more like, yeah, we're bringing down the man, we're bringing down the system, as opposed to like where Fight Club was dealing with masculinity, what it means to be a man, finance, and things like that. But if I had to parallel with something, I would say that. And I definitely think, even though it's obscure, it's well worth a watch.
For sure. And that makes a lot of sense what you're saying. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. This movie, it got pulled from the theaters. Is that right? The government or somebody did not like it. They thought the message was dangerous. Do you
You
know
know
anything
what?
about that?
I don't know anything about that. And even if that wasn't true, that's great to have as part of your movie. The government tried to
Yeah,
pull this from you, you know?
yeah,
But no, I didn't read up on it, so I'm not sure about that.
yeah.
I'll post something
Um,
on the screen after I research it before I post the video.
sure. Yeah, yeah. I think it's something like that. And I don't know. Has it ever been given a decent release on home video?
I know it's very obscure, so I would say
Yeah,
no, it hasn't been getting
yeah,
a major release. No.
yeah. I wonder if that's all part of it somehow. That this movie got kind of pulled out of circulation. I remember seeing a VHS tape many, many years ago in a bargain bin, and for some reason I can't understand, I didn't buy it, and now I really regret that. I wish I had bought that tape because I've never seen it on DVD. I've never seen a Blu-ray. You can see it online, but they tend to be very bad prints. I don't know. Is that your experience? Have you ever seen a really good print of this film?
I have not seen a good print. A friend of mine, who was a big Blaxploitation fan. He is where I got most of the Blaxploitation films I've watched from, and it was a VHS. He did have some
Right.
DVDs, but that was not a DVD copy. And again, it's super obscure. There's nothing about it based on like a box cover or the cast or anything I heard about the film that would make me watch it. But it's one of those films, it's like, oh my God, I'm so glad I watched this movie. And I think we all have some of those in our memory banks of a movie where it's like, you never heard of it. It doesn't look that appealing, but when you watch it, you're like, holy shit, how do more people not know about this film? And that's kind of how I felt when I watched this one.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's definitely a good film. It's worth seeing. I would just like it to be released in a nice edition. You know, let's get a nice print of this film out there. I don't know what the story is behind that, but
Mhm.
certainly very interesting, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah, but definitely not easy to find, but well worth the search. Next up, we have Superfly. This is probably the blaxploitation film I've watched the most, just because I love the character so much. There's so much nuance to the character, and I think it's one of the most financially successful blaxploitation films as well. And it really helped to push the commercial aspects of these films and let Hollywood know, hey, there's money to be made in doing these movies. And it gets more on the crime side and it's more on the message side. And I think it's one of the more controversial ones in that there may be a few that may be more controversial. The Spook was sat by the door, but The Spook was a movie that no one watched. This is when you combined how much it made with how controversial and how much of a deeper message it has. I think this has the best balance of any of these films and maybe any of the blaxploitation films. We are weighing message, depth, and commercial success, and I think that's this has the perfect blend of that. I would say something comparable to this would be Shaft. The reason this made my list and Shaft didn't, I think there are a lot of parallels, including father son, doing each of these movies. And Shaft is a movie we'll get into detail more later, and I'll that's where you're going to take the lead. So I'll say my part of it now, since I don't have to go as in depth with Shaft. The reason I would recommend this over Shaft, and the reason I would view them as parallels, and is in if you like Shaft, you'll like this, and if you like this, you'll like Shaft, is that they both have this protagonist that is kind of like the guy who's going against society, going against the man. He's this anti-hero rebel who's fighting for uh, people who are victimized. As much as he's a hero, he's also a victim on society. And I think people can relate to that. If people can say, hey, like, I feel like people are always pulling me down and I want to like rebel against them and I want to stick it to them and I want to come out on top. And they both kind of have that in them. I think the reason I'm more drawn to this one is because Superfly or Priest is a more nuanced character. He is very much darker. I mean, he could be the villain in a lot of other stories. There's a lot to like and a lot not to like about him. There are redeeming and non-redeeming factors to this character, and he's a vulnerable character. As much as Shaft is cool, he's almost too cool. He's like James Bond. It's like, where's your weakness? Where's your soft spot? Where's your moral dilemma? Where's your crisis of consciousness? You know, it's like, where are all those things coming from? And I think Priest goes through all of that, and I think it's a great performance and it's a great film.
Yeah, for sure. It's a very good movie. I like it a lot. And it was a huge hit, and they did make sequels to it. Although I must admit, I did not see the sequels.
Lucky you. Stay away.
Okay, well, I wondered about that, but yeah, it's definitely a good film. And the one thing I would say is that I love the soundtrack of Superfly, and I love a lot of blaxploitation soundtracks. That's actually one of the things that really made me love the genre was the music, and I would say Curtis Mayfield's score for Superfly is one of probably my top three blaxploitation soundtracks.
Music is a big part of blaxploitation, but with this film, and I love the soundtrack just like you said, but with this film in particular, with a lot of films. With this, Three the Hard Way and The Harder They Come, which is not a blaxploitation, which is falsely labeled that way a lot of places. With those three films, great soundtracks with all of them, but they do the thing that blaxploitation films do, is they very low budget. They got to kill some time to get the proper running time. And they got this great music. They will play every single strand of every note of a song and then play it again in the same movie. And all three of those movies have songs that they play from beginning to end multiple times in the film. And I'm sorry, Superfly is very guilty of that as well. So next up, we have Sweetback's Badass Song. And again, that's another film we're going to get into later on, so I won't go into too much detail with that. But again, it's very artistic, has a lot to say, was also commercially successful. I don't think it's as easy of a watch as some of the other films, maybe easier than Ganja and Hess, but not a super easy watch. It does have a lot of art to it. There's also a lot of like gratuity in there. There's a lot of naked women and a lot of love scenes. And even the filmmaker himself said he was just a horny MFer, so he just wanted a lot of those love scenes in there. So I don't want to like heap all the praise on it and not be fair and balanced, but it's definitely one of the better blaxploitation films, highly artistic, very successful, and very much worth watching.
Absolutely. It's definitely one of the essential films. Anyone interested in the genre needs to see this movie. Absolutely.
Now, with blaxploitation, you have a lot of the characters are anti-heroes. They're usually private detectives. We went over that with Shaft. A lot of them are drug dealers. We went over that with Priest and Superfly, and then a lot of them are pimps as well. And there are two in particular that stand out to me. Willie Dynamite, which is a movie I love, but it did not make my list. The Mac did. But again, I mentioned both because if you like one, you like the other, and I suggest you watch them both. But the one that did make my list is The Mac. And I think that what stands out with The Mac is it has a stronger cast. Richard Pryor is in there, and it's the more memorable of the two films, but both great films. Very much anti-hero, if you even want to call him an anti-hero at all. It may even be like one of these things like The Godfather, where it's just a movie based on the antagonist, based on the bad guy. But it's a great film and definitely worth a watch. And if you like The Mac, definitely check out Willie Dynamite.
Absolutely. I'm overdue for a rewatch of The Mac. I actually have a copy in my collection, but again, I love the soundtrack by Willie Hutch, and I have the soundtrack, and I've listened to that soundtrack a lot over the years, but it's been quite a while since I've seen the movie, so you're inspiring me now to go back and look at the movie itself. But yeah, I do recall really thinking it was good. And Willie Dynamite I've seen more recently, and I do agree it's a fun movie. It's a good movie. They're both worth watching for sure.
Next up is a movie that's not super popular, but it's definitely worth the watch. It's directed by William Wyler, which is one of my favorite filmmakers of all time. He is a white guy, so I'll let the audience know that. It's not bad to have a white director. As you said, in these specific genres, you more so think of it as a black thing. But William Wyler was a studio director back in the golden age of Hollywood. He made some of the greatest films ever made. And this is very late in his life and late in his career that he did this film. It's kind of out of left field. It's the liberation of L.B. Jones. It's a great little character drama that I think is just amazing. And it's definitely, even though it's a drama, it's definitely blaxploitation based on the content, the type of characters that they follow. But this character of L.B. Jones, the thing about William Wyler is he's great with characters, and this is one of the most gut-wrenching characters to follow in this genre, or I'm sorry, in this movement of films. And obscure, great director, great with actors, great with drama, and even this late in his career, this was a solid entry into the blaxploitation movement.
definitely very powerful stuff, very powerful film, and the cast is amazing. Cast is really good. You'd almost have to call it pre-Blaxploitation in a way, because it came out the year before, I believe, Shaft and Sweetback's badass song. But you're right though, it totally fits in with Blaxploitation, and there's a few movies like that, I think, that kind of came before, and I think of it a bit like the slasher genre. You know, we all think of Halloween starting at 1978, even though there were movies like Black Christmas and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974. So there's always movies that come earlier than the genre that we sort of think of. But yeah, this one is a great movie, and I think it's fair to call it Blaxploitation.
Yeah. Even Psycho, to go with your slasher genre, even older movie.
Yeah, absolutely.
Next up, we have Three the Hard Way. So I could have, this was definitely an action film, commercial film, pop film, not something you're going to take super serious, almost a parody of the genre itself. And it was parodied, and I'm going to get you, sucker. We already did a review on this, so you know our thoughts on it. So I could have gone with a lot of action films. The reason I went with this is because this has all three of the major action stars that proliferated the Blaxploitation movement. All three of them are in there. So rather than racking my brain trying to figure out like which one am I going to pick, this one has all three. This one is more than entertaining enough that if you like this, go check out all three of those guys in some of their films, like Slaughter, Little Caesar, not Little Caesar, Black Caesar, etc. Black Belt Jones. You can check out all of their other movies, but this is a good entry point.
Absolutely, and it's a very fun movie. It's one of my personal favorites. Probably one of the first real Blaxploitation films I saw when I was young. So yeah, definitely I would recommend it. And if you want to know more, take a look at that other review we did of this movie specifically.
And that was a very fun review. I had a lot of time reviewing that movie, and I loved it. I mean,
yeah,
the review made me like the movie even more. Honestly,
yes, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Next up, and the last movie on my top 10 list. I know I mentioned a lot more than 10 films, but again, the actual movies that made the list. The last one, I wrestled with this. I had to call a buddy of mine to just confirm that I should put this on the list. Because as we get down to this, and there's one left, I'm sure you're probably thinking, man, there's so many great movies not here yet. What are you going to go with? And it's going to be a movie that's not a great movie, but it's super important and it belongs on this list, and it's Dolomite. I love Dolomite ironically, where it's just like it's so bad it's good. And that's one of the reasons why I didn't want to put it on this list. But the story of how Dolomite was made and the importance of it, where this is a true grassroots film. Talk about the fact that there's a lot of white people with money behind a lot of these films. Hollywood is behind a lot of these films. A lot of these films are just put out there copying other movies that were made, just put in black in the title. This was a true grassroots thing where an independent guy went out there, made his own movie, put everything on the line, went city to city promoting it. Don't take my word for it. Eddie Murphy made a movie about this you can watch. But Dolomite is definitely on the list. You like it, watch more Rudy Ray films, Rudy Moore films, and watch My Name is Dolomite with Eddie Murphy as well, if you like this one.
Well, I'm very glad you did put this on the list, because I think I said to you, I always have a huge problem trying to come up with any sort of top 5 or top 10, because I get down to about number 7 and I think, oh my God, there's so many other things. How can I get them all on here? And it becomes a real mess. And I also have that same problem of, am I putting on only the films that I think are really great films, or am I putting on films that I love, even though they're not so great? And Dolomite is exactly the one I was thinking it would have to go on my list, even though it's not a great movie, but it is a really fun movie. It is so much fun. It's one of my personal favorites. I love all of the Rudy Ray Moore films. The first one I saw was actually The Avenging Disco Godfather, And that really turned me on to the whole thing, and I had to collect them all up. And you know, the last time I watched Dolomite, I think within the first 10 seconds, I knew that this was awesome. You know, it does not take
The minute
long.
you see the boom mic, you're like, okay.
And I don't think I've ever met anyone who's seen this movie and didn't enjoy it. You know, it's such a fun experience to watch that movie. It has to be on the list for sure.
Yeah. So again, if I were to give you a list of my top 10 favorites, some of these movies would not be on the list. But I like all of them. They all represent a different part of the movement. They're all super important, and they're all entry points. That's why I mentioned, like, hey, Shaft isn't on the list. Shaft would be on 9 out of 10 people's list. Well, I give you a reason why, and a movie on the list that if you like, you'll like Shaft. So that's why I try to counterbalance it. Blackula would, you know, but again, I gave you Ganja and Hess. So I didn't want to be too repetitive. I see some of these lists online, they have like 4 Pam Grier movies. It's like, no, you watch one Pam Grier movie. You get the point. If they like it, they'll watch the other Pam Grier movies. So that's kind of the approach I took. But that's my list. I think those are great entry points if you're not super familiar with the genre. And again, what started this, the catalyst for this was, again, me bringing this up to some coworkers and they saying, does that have anything to do with Black Lives Matter? So hopefully people who thought like that or don't know much about the genre will be inspired to maybe watch a couple of Blaxploitation films, maybe some of those on the list. So that is my spiel. This is where I let you take over. And you're going to get into, so part of the show is we're going to try to spotlight a director, gods of cinema, if you will, every episode. But for this week, because there weren't a lot of this movement didn't last long, and a lot of the filmmakers in this movement didn't make a lot of movies, and the ones that did, they didn't exclusively make Blaxploitation films. So because of that, we're going to spotlight 2 directors. We're going to break from our form, but that is the reason we're making that exception. I'll let you take the lead. I'll chime in a little bit, but the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, like you just said, when we decided we needed to do a Blaxploitation director, it was very hard to come up with the ideal choice. But the person that I felt that I really needed to talk about was Gordon Parks, or Gordon Parks Sr., because his son, Gordon Parks Jr., also made Blaxploitation films, as we've already mentioned. But Gordon Parks, he's a really interesting and talented guy. He's been described as a Renaissance man, and I think that's a fair description because he's done a lot of different things in his life, a lot of different artistic things. He's written poetry, he's written novels, he's composed music, and perhaps most famously, he became a photographer for Life magazine. And he actually traveled the world for Life magazine. He spent some years in Paris, which was considered probably the most desirable assignment for a photojournalist in those days. So he was very successful in that field. And at an age when a lot of people would be thinking about retiring, he decided to start something new, which was essentially making feature films. He became a filmmaker in his late 50s. And it came about because Hollywood became interested in turning his novel, his autobiographical novel, The Learning Tree, into a movie. And they wanted him to adapt the script from the novel. They also wanted him to direct, and they knew he was a composer, so they said, hey, why don't you also write the music for the movie? And while you're at it, you can produce. So he kind of went from almost no experience in film to almost being an auteur, where he's doing everything. He's all over this movie. He had done some short films before that, but they were almost more like extensions of his photojournalism, his photo essays. He would narrate them, and we'd see a lot of his photos, and they were short and almost like documentaries. But The Learning Tree was a feature film. It was a drama, and while we couldn't really call it Blaxploitation, it does have a lot of the elements that would go on to become quite common in Blaxploitation. I mean, it deals with racism, it deals with poverty, it has crime, it has violence, it has a little bit of sex and nudity, but it's not an exploitation film. It's a much more serious film, and it's a good film. And it was apparently, it's considered to be the first feature film at a major Hollywood studio directed by a black man. So it was quite a historic thing. And so after that movie, he was given the opportunity to direct Shaft, which was also based on a novel, although this time it wasn't his novel. It was written by Ernest Tidyman, I believe. And he adapted the novel into a screenplay. And apparently he originally, even though the character of John Shaft is black in the novel, he actually decided to make him white in the first draft of the screenplay. Perhaps because he thought that was the only way that it would ever get made. But when Gordon Parks came on board, he said, no, he's black, and I'm casting Richard Roundtree. And Richard Roundtree was not really very well known at the time. He hadn't really done very much. He'd done some commercials, but he was not in any way a big star. But Gordon Parks must have seen something in him. And Richard Roundtree later said that he believed the character of John Shaft was kind of modeled after Gordon Parks, at least by Gordon Parks. Gordon Parks took him and to stores and then bought clothes and, you know, sort of outfitted him and sort of made him in his own image in a way, which is interesting because I've heard something similar about the early James Bond films and Terrence Young. I think a lot of the Bond stuff, like the Martini, shaken not stirred or whatever, that was actually Terrence Young who really, that was kind of him, and he kind of gave that stuff to Bond. So in a way, Gordon Parks was maybe doing that with John Shaft and sort of creating,
or at least a romanticized version of that.
Yes, exactly, a romanticized version of himself. You know, as we've maybe alluded to already, it was the film was a huge success, obviously, and it spawned 2 sequels and a TV series. And then 30 years later, there was a remake with Samuel L. Jackson. And I'm surprised to discover there was another remake maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I didn't even know about that one. I didn't even hear about that. But clearly, you know, a very successful film. And it was really, well, because it's so successful is really one of the reasons that it was one of the movies that really kicked off Blaxploitation into the thing that it became, the huge successful genre.
This is not a movie I really gave a chance to. And I think when you brought this up as something like you really wanted to talk about in depth, I kind of pulled away and I was like, maybe we should talk about his son because I like Superfly more. But when I gave it a chance, I actually really liked it more than I thought I would because I never saw it before. It just didn't come off as a film that I wanted to watch because I'm not into the James Bond cool guy that always gets it. There's no depth to characters like that. It's just, it's not really for me. Not that it's bad, it's just it's not for me. I'm not into action movies that much. I love crime movies, not into action at all. Unless I like it ironically, like, you know, I love Schwarzenegger movies because the acting is so cheesy. So I like it ironically more so than I actually like it. But I actually did like this movie a lot more than I thought I would. One question I have for you, since this is my first watch. So the copy I watched was a Criterion version, but there was a lot of ADR. Is the ADR something that Criterion did or the restored versions did? Or is that something that was part of like one of the older copies? Because it's a lot of noticeable ADR where it's like, you're not saying that. Like the background noise changes drastically when you say that line. Like I know you're saying that in a studio, not in the street. And it's just like really distracting because there's a lot of lines like that.
Wow. I don't know is the short answer. I don't think I've ever really noticed that. But I have noticed that sometimes when they do clean up these movies and they release them in a good format, sometimes that reveals things to me like, oh yeah, that does sound like ADR there. Whereas my old VHS tape, I never really noticed that somehow. It maybe wasn't good enough quality for that. So I don't know. I've never noticed that, but that's an interesting question.
It was really distracting. I'll put it on the screen. I'll do some online research and put it on the screen now
Okay.
to see what I find, but it was a little distracting. It took
Okay.
away from my enjoyment because like it's like why I focused on more on like why was that line ADR'd more so than the scene itself, you know, when it
Yeah.
happened. But aside from that, I thought it was really good. I mean, it was a lot of good action, and it was kind of weird. It had almost like an old Hollywood ending because old Hollywood films, before they came up with a real structure that they do now, the endings would it would end on the climax. There wouldn't really be much of a third act at all. And this one pretty much ended on the climax without a third act. We don't know like what happened when they took the girl to the gangster. Did he did he pay him? Did he turn on them? Like how many guys got killed? How many guys lived? Like what are the consequences of Shaft? Like he cheated on his girl. Is there any consequences to that? His girl was barely a part of the film. Should we even care? Like, you know, so there's it's not like a typical film made post 1950 where there was a full third act. It almost seems like the third act was just disregarded, which I'm not complaining about. I like abrupt endings, but the ending was kind of abrupt.
Yes, it was actually. Now that you mention it, it reminded me of some writing advice I had been given a few years ago when I was working on a play, and I wanted to put in all this information at the end explaining what happened to all these different characters because it was based on history. And the guy I was working with said, nope, nope. Once the climax happens, you know, once that final fight happens or whatever, it's over, you know, and so you just have to kind of end it. Don't put in all this other stuff. It's like suddenly another movie is starting or another play is starting. So it made me think of that watching the end to Shaft again, because you're right, it does end, boom, and the camera kind of pans up and we see the police pulling up in the background and we see him walking away, and it's kind of like the movie's still going, but we're done, you know, and the credits are rolling. And I kind of like that, actually. I kind of
It's
like that
different
ending.
because it's different because again, once you get past that golden age of Hollywood, like movies don't end like that anymore. They
No,
let you know the
no,
consequences for all the actions you saw. They give you a
yeah,
chance to see what happens from the characters based on all the major actions from the climax. So, but I liked
yeah,
it. I did think one, if it was made today, I think, well, it was made today. Like you said, they made another one.
yeah, yes,
But I did think they missed out on a really good opportunity. In that, like, when he made the phone call, and it was like, when the guy said, "Is this Shaft?" They should have just cut right there and hit "You damn right" and just play the song, you know? I think that would have
yeah,
been perfect. Because I'm like, I never saw the end before now. And I saw him on the phone. I'm like, they're gonna end it with "You damn right." They're gonna end it with "You damn right." And they didn't. I was like, damn, that would have been perfect. Shaft,
yeah,
damn right. You know, that would have been awesome. Awesome.
yeah,
But it is a fun movie. Again, the character isn't super nuanced because he doesn't really go. I mean, he's kind of an anti-hero, but he's a good guy. And he's not, I
hmm,
mean, he cheated on his girl. We don't even know his girlfriend. We don't even, she's
yeah,
not even a real character. So it's not like, oh my God, like how could he cheat on her? Like she's so what? We don't know her, you know?
hmm,
The girl he cheated with probably got more screen time than the girlfriend, honestly.
yeah,
So aside from that, which is, I guess, questionably morally, but he didn't really make a lot of tough moral choices. He pretty much did the right thing the whole way. So,
yeah,
aside from the fact that it wasn't too nuanced, I think that can make it a more fun experience as well. Because for a fun action movie, you don't want to like have moments where you're questioning your hero or rooting against your hero or thinking about
yeah,
should I be rooting for this guy? Is this guy like a good guy? You know, it's like sometimes you just want the fun and you don't want
yeah,
to think. And this is good
yeah.
for that.
I love this movie. I love Shaft, and you know, for me, part of what I love is that well, first of all, I love that, Gordon Parks really creates a very clear world to me, and I mean, I was never in New York in 1971. I don't know, but to me, it creates at least a believable impression that this is what it was like, and they shoot on location and they're in some real places, like the No Name Bar and Cafe Reggio. Those are just real places in New York, right? And so I find that fascinating. It's like a time capsule. But also, aside from that, every character in this movie, no matter how small, has something unique and interesting about them. They don't throw away any characters, like even the waitress in Cafe Reggio or the gay bartender in the No Name Bar. These are interesting, unusual characters who actually are kind of funny. They say and do things that are amusing, and they could have just been complete throwaways. Oh, it's a waitress. She just brings him his coffee or whatever, and that's it. But
I think that's a good point. Not to cut you off, I think that's a good point. I think that's what disappointed me about The Girlfriend the most, is that they did spend the time to give some of these people personalities and quirks and things that make you say, oh, like they could have left that conversation out of the movie and it wouldn't have made a difference. Like the waitress with, oh, I always forget the twist of, what was it, lime or lemon or something? I always forget it. Yeah, I always forget it. And she brought it back. And that whole interaction didn't need to be there, but it was interesting. And I think that's why it stood out to me more, that the girlfriend was just like there, is because they did spend the time to, develop some of these characters, or like you said, give them quirks to, make them feel like, all right, it's worth spending a few minutes with this character.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, that's an interesting point. The girlfriend maybe isn't quite as developed, but I was going to say the whole idea of him cheating on his girlfriend and having a multitude of women who are interested in him, that's very James Bond-like too in the era, right? James Bond was always getting together with all kinds of women. So I think it's like, it's 1971, right? It's the swinging 70s or whatever you want to say about it. It's sort of the lifestyle or something that it's portraying. But yeah, I mean, even the mafia thug who comes to meet him in Cafe Reggio, he insults Shaft, and then Shaft insults him, and he kind of chuckles. He laughs. He kind of enjoys that Shaft has nerve and that he's kind of funny, and then Shaft insults him again, and he chuckles again. Like it's you don't really see that too often. You don't see thugs in movies exhibiting that kind of behavior. They're just thugs. But
it's that kind of masculine tussle, where it's just like, I'm gonna drop my dick on this table. Well, I'm gonna drop my dick on this table. What now? We both got dicks. All right, let's just have a drink. It's kind of like, that's what these tough guys do, and they expect the other guy to back down. So it's interesting that, you're right. Neither back down. Is like, okay, well, fuck it. Let's just chill. So.
Yeah, they kind of respected each other in a way there.
Yeah.
But I also love the bad guys, or some of the bad guys, Bumpy, the gangster, and Willie, his sort of right-hand man. In any other movie,
where was that fight? Where's that fight they promised us?
Oh yeah,
Willie's like, before this is over, like like we're gonna go at it.
Yeah. But then Shaft says, "No, you're not gonna do shit." And then you're right. They never do. But what I find really enjoyable is that those guys are kind of likable. They're bad guys, but you kind of like them. They're entertaining. And I love that Willie is so upset about the guy who Shaft threw out the window, right? He keeps going on about, how could he have done that? He threw my man Leroy out the window. It's like any other movie, henchmen get killed and you just never hear about them again. But this guy's upset that Willie went out the window.
It's almost like a parody of other movies not mentioning it, It's almost like self-aware. It's like, wait a minute, someone died. Like, hello, like
Yeah,
someone died. Why am I the only one that cares?
exactly,
You're
exactly.
right. That's a great point. In that, like, it matters to him.
Yeah,
He's like, dude, he just killed somebody, and we're just hanging out in his office. Like, what are we
yeah,
doing?
exactly. Yeah, yeah. And also, his relationship with the police lieutenant, who, on the one hand, the police lieutenant he seems to really want to be Shaft's friend. He seems to want to help him. He's giving him breaks. He's letting him go. But Shaft is still kind of standoffish and is kind of rude to him and says, "I'm not going to help you," or whatever. But by the end of the movie, you kind of get the sense that they do kind of have some sort of friendly relationship, and Shaft does call him, from the no name bar, which is another of my favorite scenes, where he goes to the bar because there are these guys there who are wanting to kill him, right? And they're watching his apartment across the street. And so he kind of sees that they're there, and he identifies that they're the guys. And I mean, that's all he would have needed to do. But instead, he decides, I'm going to impersonate the bartender, and I'm going to serve these guys drinks, and I'm going to talk to them. And he sort of makes a big thing out of it. And then he calls his police lieutenant buddy and says, "Hey, I've got what you're looking for. Come on down here." And he has this secret conversation in front of them, and it's all very amusing. It's also a little bit suspenseful because these guys are there to kill him, and if they figure out who he is, they might do that. But anyway, it's just, to me, it's another example of a scene that they have a lot more fun with it than they would have had to, if you know what I mean. They really make something out of it. It's a great little set piece, I would say.
Yeah,
I love that.
one thing I'll give to this film too is a lot of these blaxploitation films have a lot of filler in them. This didn't really have a lot of filler in that the things that filled up scenes, like the scenes you're talking about, they didn't feel like, oh, this is just padding. It felt entertaining. It felt like, all right, this is just part of the movie. It's part of the
Yeah,
world building that they're doing and they're
yeah,
immersing us in, as opposed to a film that I like more, but quite honestly, how many times are you going to play the same song over and over again in the movie? I can listen to the soundtrack for that.
yeah,
I don't need to see you ride a car for 5 minutes
yeah,
because the
yeah,
car is like something that costs a lot of money and it took you a while to talk this gangster into letting you use his pimped out car in the movie, seen in Superfly, as opposed to here where it's like everything, even if it didn't move the story along, it built the world. And it wasn't just
hmm,
like, man, Mayfield's a cool cat. It's a great song.
yeah,
I didn't feel
yeah,
that way, even though this is a great soundtrack too. I didn't
yeah.
feel that way, like, oh, they're just playing this song out with like background filler.
No, 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 absolutely not. And to me, every scene in this movie it's a great little moment. There's something to it, even if it's not an action scene, because in a way, for an action film, there's not that much action, right? It's a lot of character stuff. It's guys talking to each other, and it's a lot of build up, a lot of suspense. Like the climactic sequence in this film, it's really more about the buildup. It's getting the guys into place and making sure they're ready, and then the actual moment of action is quite brief, where they kind of put their plan into effect, and it's very effective, because you've been building up to it for 10 minutes or something, and then boom, it just suddenly happens. So it's it's surprising how little action there really is in it, but it's all very effective when it happens, and you feel like you've had a real experience. You feel like you've had action, but to me, it's those moments, those little moments where the characters are kind of interacting, that really make the film for me. And I
Mhm.
love those moments. I love every second of this movie. I don't
Yeah.
know how many times I've watched it.
Yeah. Again, this for me, this is the only time I have watched and I did like it. I will say this. I think I think you're right. The amount of action doesn't warrant labeling this an action film. But to me, it's 100% an action film because of a couple of things. One is the action when it does happen is really over the top. Like throwing a guy through a window, it's pretty over the top. Like
Yes,
breaking
yes,
into the window, like lighting, the cocktail with his cigar and then throwing it in and blasting him with a
yeah,
machine. The
yes.
action is it's significantly over the top. A and B, Shaft is 100% an action star.
Hmm.
He has all the one-liners. He gets the girls. He checks every box of what an action star is, and he doesn't necessarily check all the boxes of a Nuance character, but he
Yeah,
has all the one-liners. He's the cool guy. He's smoking the cigar. He gets the girl. He outsmarts everybody. He knows who to talk to. He knows where to go. He's one step ahead of you. He's everything you want your action star to be, even though again there isn't a lot of action. It 100% is an action movie, and Shaft is an action hero, I feel.
yeah, yeah. I agree. I agree, and I think it's true that he's not a very nuanced character, and like you said earlier, he is almost too perfect in a way. But I think that that was kind of, I've heard the same thing said about Sidney Poitier's character and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, that he's so perfect. But they kind of needed to do that because they wanted the only issue to be race. They didn't want the issue to be anything else. It's like, I don't want you to marry my daughter because you're unemployed or something. You know, that would have given them another reason to not like him, right? But he's not only employed, he's a doctor, and you know, he's such a perfect character. I feel that Shaft is similarly very, very perfect. And I think that Gordon Parks kind of said that to him, the most important thing about this was that people see a black man being the hero and winning. You know, they needed to see him win all the time. Like that was kind of the most important thing to Gordon Parks, and so it makes sense to me, right? Um,
Yeah,
and I
under
think he
that
does,
lens it makes a lot of sense.
yeah. And I think he does have one moment where he isn't perfect. That's when he kind of underestimates the mafia
When
and
he
he
got
gets shot.
shot, dude, I
Yeah,
was so shocked he got shot.
yeah, yeah,
He's like,
yeah,
oh, again,
yeah,
this is my first time watching it. I'm like, God,
yeah,
he's Mr. Perfect. They're gonna shoot up
yeah,
the guy he's
yeah,
holding. That guy's gonna
yeah,
take all the bullets, and Shaft is gonna kill them. When he got
yeah,
shot and then they kicked him, I was shocked. But when he
yeah,
recovered from the bullet wound and didn't even feel it afterwards, I was nuts.
yeah,
There were like
yeah.
no repercussions from that bullet wound, you know. But yeah, I
True
was
enough.
shocked.
Yeah,
I was shocked they even
yeah,
let him get shot.
yeah. And I mean, yeah, in terms of character nuance, no, I mean he's basically just he is kind of a perfect action hero or a perfect private eye character.
Mhm.
He's but I think that's what he was designed to be, and it makes sense to me, and I enjoy watching him.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of a guy that's not really popular to bring up right now, Bill Cosby,
Hmm.
because before all the controversy, before we found out about some of the things that he did, uh, the Cosby Show was one of the greatest sitcoms ever. And a part of the success of it was he didn't want black people to be portrayed in a negative light in any way. And he wanted to be realistic and like, is it plausible? Like these people can be, successful and things like that. But he didn't want them to be betrayed negative in any light possible, because the only way he was going to get into white homes is to be as wholesome as he possibly could be, and to be as non-offensive, and to be as welcoming, and all those qualities that, again, it sounds like what the idea of Shaft was. It's kind of similar. It's just like, okay, like we want people who aren't part of this, who aren't part of these poor neighborhoods, who don't look like me or talk like me or act like me, to like something I'm doing, which I think people now can learn from, because a lot of entertainment now, it's very exclusive instead of inclusive. It's just like, if you want someone to watch your movie with a gay star, like don't like start preaching to them on their non-tolerance. And it's just like I think like a lot of movies now is just like they're only made for the they're all preaching to the choir. They're only made for like a certain audience that already know they're gonna like it, and they're not trying to reach other people, you know? And I think, you know, the point you made there from your research on it makes a lot of sense, and is probably why it was commercially successful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we've spent a lot of time on Shaft here, but I should say a few words about Shaft's big score, which is the sequel to Shaft, also directed by Gordon Parks. And first of all, I just want to say that yes, I love the music in Shaft. I love Isaac Hayes' soundtrack, and it was a huge success. It won Academy Awards. Obviously sold a lot of copies. It was a hit. So when they went to do Shaft's big score, apparently they asked Isaac Hayes to do the soundtrack, but he said no because they wouldn't pay the money that he felt he should get. So instead, Gordon Parks thought, well, I'll just do it myself. And as I alluded to, Gordon Parks was a composer, and he did compose good music. You just have to watch The Learning Tree and listen to the music he did for that movie to hear that he is very good. But unfortunately, in Shaft's big score, he was kind of trying to be Isaac Hayes, and so he kind of did a theme that was really kind of trying to be the theme from Shaft all over again. And he, well, let's face it, he's not Isaac Hayes. He's different. So it almost comes off as a parody of itself. It's kind of a ridiculous kind of a song in a way, but don't get me wrong, I love it. I love it for that reason. It's so over the top and ridiculous, but you certainly don't ever hear that song. It did not win any awards. It did not. It's not a hit, you know. But it's one of those weird little, oh gee, why did they do this? You know, why didn't they just reuse the song from the first movie or something? But no, they created a new one. And Shaft's big score, I would say it's a good movie. It's an entertaining movie. I don't like it quite as much as Shaft. I think it doesn't have quite as much of the charm and all those little characters and the little scenes. There isn't quite as much of that. And part of what I loved about Shaft was that he is a private detective, and we see him doing the work of a private detective. He investigates, he walks around talking to people, you know, he investigates. But in Shaft's big score, he's not really being a private eye so much. He just kind of gets involved in a situation, and he kind of keeps reacting to things as they happen. But he doesn't have a client per se, and we never even see his office. We don't see his private eye office. So we kind of lose a little bit of that private eye charm. And what's interesting is it's more of an action film, I would say, than the first one. There's more action, and they obviously had more money to spend on it. So you can kind of tell, because the climactic chase sequence, which involves cars, a helicopter, boats, I mean, it's a huge action sequence that goes on forever and ever. And it's an achievement, but it's much more of an action scene, whereas the climax of Shaft is more about the build-up to the very quick action sequence. And I actually prefer that to the over-the-top action of Shaft's big score. But it is still an entertaining movie, and it's very well done. And Richard Roundtree is the same guy as John Shaft. He's got all the same attitudes, and he's just as capable as he was in the first film. Bumpy and Willie do return, which I'm happy to see, because I really liked those characters in the first movie. And I think that one of the inspired moments in this movie is that Willie actually goes with Shaft on one of the little side missions to try and get some information or something out of the mafia guys who've been getting in his way. So I thought that was inspired to have Willie and Shaft kind of working together. And then Shaft kind of gets into a fight and is not doing as well as you might expect, and Willie kind of is laughing at him, just not helping him out. So it's kind of, in a way, a sequel to their confrontations in the first film. But overall, I would say it's not quite as good as Shaft, but it's still an entertaining sequel. What did you think of this one?
I kind of think of like the first thing that came into my mind is like Beverly Hills Cop 2. Well, Beverly Hills Cop is one of my favorite comedies. Eddie Murphy is awesome. At the end of the sequel, they forgot what made it good, and they focused on the wrong stuff. And it's like, oh my God, let's make Eddie Murphy an action star. No, Eddie Murphy was a comedian. Let's have more funny scenes, not have more bigger action, you know? So I just think it kind of missed the mark. And I never begrudge people who make sequels, because sequels is generally where you make your money. And I didn't know that thing about Isaac Hayes, but I don't begrudge Isaac Hayes, because the sequel is really where you make your money. And if they're not going to pay you to do it a second time around, like, why call you back if you're not willing to give them a little bit more, you know? So, yeah, not really for me. I'm just thrilled. I'm still high on the fact that I like Shaft, because I didn't watch it my entire life, because I just assumed I wouldn't like it. And if it wasn't for us doing this podcast, I wouldn't have watched it. So I'm too much of a high on liking Shaft to knock the sequels too much.
Yeah,
but I would just say I didn't really care for it.
Yeah, well, that's fair enough. And like I said, I don't think it's as good. I think Shaft is the one that really, really matters. But it's still a fun movie, and I do enjoy it. And even Shaft in Africa, the third film, which Gordon Parks did not make, that one has some interesting things in it as well. And I think that's where they really try to make him into James Bond, because he starts traveling around the world, not just Africa, but he also goes to France, I believe, in that one. So he really is becoming James Bond by the third movie. But yeah, for my taste, Shaft is the great one. And after those two movies, Gordon Parks made a movie called The Super Cops, which is not a blaxploitation movie per se, but it does have some blaxploitation elements in it. It's the true story of two white cops who are considered to be troublemakers, and they're sent to a fictional precinct, which I guess is supposed to be one of the worst precincts in the city. And I think they're just expected to rot there. But instead, they start busting drug dealers, and they start making waves. And it's somewhere in Brooklyn that this fictitious precinct is, and the neighborhood is largely black. And so in a way, it's like these characters are dropped into a bit of a blaxploitation world. And they do deal with some of the same issues that the blaxploitation films deal with: the racism, the poverty, all that kind of stuff. So it's an interesting movie to see. I don't think it's as good as Shaft either, but it's interesting to see that it's still got some of the same elements. He also made a movie called Lead Belly, which is a biography of the guitar player Lead Belly. I haven't seen it. I actually thought it was a documentary when I heard about it, but it turns out no, it's actually a drama, and it stars Roger E. Mosley, who many of us remember from Magnum P.I., but he also I think he did appear in some blaxploitation films. So I don't know, maybe Lead Belly has some blaxploitation elements. I'm not sure. I haven't seen it. But
I think he might have been in the Mac.
Oh, he might be, actually, now that you say that. Yeah, he might be. I know he's also in Terminal Island, which is a movie I quite like, which is not blaxploitation, but it's also blaxploitation adjacent, because it has some elements of that. It also has some elements of women in prison films, but it's kind of its own thing. Mm-hmm. But the last one that Gordon Parks made was made for TV, and it was called Simon Northup's Odyssey. It's actually based on the same source material as 12 Years a Slave, that big movie that came out a few years
Mm,
ago.
hmm.
And this was a made-for-TV film in the early '80s, and I had no idea that it was the same story, but I watched it because it was Gordon Parks. This is years ago now, and I was impressed by it. I thought it was very good, and I mean, it's not Blaxploitation exactly, but it again deals with some of the same kind of themes. Um, and I thought it was very good, and I thought to myself, well, I don't need to see 12 Years a Slave now because I've already seen this, and this was good enough, like I'm not sure what they could have done better in 12 Years a Slave, except that maybe it would be more R rated or something. I don't know. But there you have it. That's sort of Gordon Parks. He did do some documentaries and things, but those are kind of the big films, and not a huge list, but still, I think some significant stuff there.
Yeah,
And
not a god of cinema, but definitely worth the spotlight. Um, and again, this was not a movie I thought I was going to like. Pleasantly surprised, highly recommend, and I'm glad you pushed me to watch it.
okay, well, I'm very glad too. That's great. I don't intend to go into as much detail on Melvin Van Peebles, but I did want to talk about Sweetback's Badass Song, because along with Shaft, those are the two movies that really are most often credited with starting the Blaxploitation genre. And as we've already mentioned, there were movies that came out before that, including Cotton Comes to Harlem, but none of them really started the genre. It was the success of these two movies, because they were both huge hits. And in some ways, they're polar opposites from each other, because
That's the
Shaft
exact
is
same thing I was thinking. Could these films
yeah,
be more different?
yeah,
Like
exactly.
one movie looks like it was made with a home camera,
Yeah,
it's like all helter skelter, and the other one looks like
yeah,
a polished Hollywood movie.
that's exactly right. I mean, Shaft is basically, I mean, there was a bit of a resurgence of private eye movies in the late '60s, with people like Paul Newman and Frank Sinatra playing private eyes. And so this really kind of fits in with that. It's just another private eye movie made by Hollywood. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean, it could have been, and especially if Ernest Tidyman had gotten his way with the first draft of the script and made the character white, then this could have been a movie that maybe somebody like Paul Newman, or maybe 30 years before, Humphrey Bogart maybe could have played this character. It would have been different, but it's basically that kind of movie. It's a fairly mainstream Hollywood movie.
The only
On the other hand,
thing, the only thing that Shaft lacks to make you feel like this wouldn't just be a regular Hollywood movie if a white guy was in it is, I guess they couldn't afford a lot of car scenes for like car chases. That's the only thing. If you
yeah,
had him driving around instead of walking around, I'm sure walking around was a lot cheaper to film and to coordinate and with the streets and getting them blocked off and another car following another car to get the shots. Aside from the driving scenes, this is like, I mean, it's like French Connection or something. It's just a regular, gritty shot on the streets of New York, 1970s crime drama, except this was more of an action. But I mean, it's very similar to those in the look and the feel of it, and it's a very polished film. I mean,
yes,
I'm just bringing that up again just to contrast it with Sweetback,
yes,
which is so not polished. It is so not polished.
that's right. That's exactly right. And I was going to say that unlike Shaft, Sweetback is not a movie that somebody like Paul Newman could have been in,
You could
or
have stopped
Humphrey
right
Bogart.
there. You could have just said Sweetback is not a movie.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I would say it is, unlike a major studio film. It is kind of the epitome of a low budget independent film. It is so low budget, and it is so rough and raw and edgy. It is very edgy. I mean, it famously got an X rating, right? Which they then turned into publicity. But
Brilliantly. Rated X by an all-white jury. Was that it? Was that
that's it. That's right. Yeah.
brilliant?
So I mean, X-rated, and the opening sequence was actually cut from the British prints of the movie because it depicts very graphically a young boy having sex with a grown woman.
His son, yeah.
Yeah, his son Mario,
Who went on to have
playing
a
that.
very successful career.
He did, yes. And incidentally, he made a movie called Badass, which I don't know if you've seen, but it's about the making of Sweetback's Badass song.
I heard about it.
And
I didn't see it. Did you actually see it, or you just read about it?
No, I did see it. I actually bought a copy in a bargain bin somewhere for like $1, and I didn't know what it was. I thought it was a documentary about the making of. I was surprised that no, this is a drama. Mario plays his father in the movie.
He looks nothing like his father.
Well, that may be, but it's great though. It's a great movie, and I think for anybody interested in low-budget filmmaking, it's a very interesting movie to watch. And certainly, if you're interested in Sweetback, you should give that one a look. But anyway, it was so edgy and so raw that you can't even. It's like a completely different animal from Shaft. But and I think Shaft appealed to a very broad audience as well, whereas I think Sweetback was maybe more just for the Black community, maybe when it first came out. I'm not sure if it reached further than that, but in any case, it was a massive success.
I don't know why people outside, I mean, at the time, obviously you'd watch it now, and a lot of white people and non-Blacks would watch it now, but why would a non-Black person watch Sweetback back when it came out?
Well,
I mean, I could see Shaft because it's an appealing movie, you know?
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Sweetback is just so, I mean, marketing, I think, is really what sets Sweetback apart. Marketing.
Yeah.
My favorite movie of all time, I may have mentioned this before, but I'll mention it now, is 2001: A Space Odyssey. My favorite movie of all time. Super artistic movie. Super artistic. Not conventional in any way in the way it plays out. People now would watch it, studied in film schools, consider it a great film. But back then, the only reason people watch it is because of the marketing. They're like, oh my, what a trip. People took acid and watched it and be like, oh man, this Kubrick, man. You know, it's kind of like, I think it's kind of like with Sweetback. It's like, why would you watch Sweetback if it wasn't for the marketing? Rated X by an all-white jury, nudity, sex, and blowing up a police car and band. And the marketing is what really got people to watch it. Ultimately, it has its longevity because it is highly artistic and it is worth studying, but at the time, you know.
Yeah. Well, I would say that it's almost more of an experimental film in some ways. It uses experimental film techniques. You know, some of the editing and the montage sequences are very unusual, and you know, lines of dialogue get repeated again and again in a way that doesn't reflect realism in any way. It's more artistic. It's making a point, and it is almost a surrealistic experience, I think, watching Sweetback's Badass Song. It's not a straightforward narrative kind of film. Would you agree with that? It's
an art house film. It's almost like an Andy Warhol film in a way. I know that's not a compliment because Andy Warhol made some pretty films, but it's almost an Andy Warhol film in that Andy Warhol did a lot of nudity and you know, stuff like that, and it was just about experimenting, trying different things, different ways of expressing, trying to like artistically say things that could easily be said with dialogue, but trying to say it with images and trying to create emotions and out of people, and show emotions that characters are feeling in non-traditional ways. It's 100% an art house movie. It's 100% this guy throwing things at the wall and just trying different things. I think he even said he went overseas, watched a bunch of like artistic films, and then used some of those techniques himself.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just super much. It's all art house. And again,
Yeah.
why are black people watching an art house film? If anything, white people would be, hippies would be watching an art house film on acid, but I think it was the marketing that really got people in there. And the fact that they knew this guy wrote, directed, and starred in it. It's like they're supporting this brother making his movie, sticking it to the man. This was the first, I'm a black guy. I did this on my own. I stood up to the, racists. There was a real backstory on those Hell's Angels, where there was real drama behind the scenes. It's like all this stuff is real. He doesn't have to make it up. It's all real. I mean, he's even said he really had sex with these women. Part of what helped him finish the movie is that he joined the union, got, I think, chlamydia or something, and that he used that money to help him finish, get more scenes done. So a lot of what you're watching, it's all reality, and it's like you're supporting this brother, you're following the reality of what's going on more so than like, man, oh, I can't wait to watch what happens in the next scene or the plot or the ending, or none of that really matters. It's just about like you're part of something, and they were part of the start of the movement that lasted 10 years, you know?
Yeah.
But the movie itself, I enjoy it because I watched over 1,000 films. I get tired of the pattern of movies because after a while, you see the pattern coming. That's why we spoke earlier about like it was interesting to me that Shaft didn't have a third act, and for me and it's interesting to me that 2001: A Space Odyssey is so different. And for me, this is interesting to me. This was is one of my favorite exploitation movies because it's so different. It doesn't follow a pattern. You don't know what's coming. You don't know why this is happening. Makes you think, makes you feel things, and the backstory of knowing what happened and how it got done, and knowing that this is just one guy's vision and he did it. All that plays into it. You take all that away and you just watch it as a movie, trying to be entertained. Good luck, because it's tough, man. It's not easy,
Yeah.
No,
definitely not. It's not an easy film, and if I was going to try to describe the plot, it would be difficult. But I guess
why would you do that to yourself?
Well, we're trying to analyze the film, but
sure.
But it seems to me that at the beginning of the film you see the character of Sweetback as a child, and he seems to be working in a whorehouse, perhaps, and he gets seduced maybe by one of the older, one of the prostitutes in this house, and then she kind of says, "You have a sweet back," or something, which maybe is where he gets his name from. And then he transforms into the adult version. He becomes Melvin Van Peebles sort of at the end of that scene, so it's almost like she made him a man or something. And then it seems like as an adult he works in that whorehouse. He performs live sex shows in that whorehouse. I don't know if he's also a prostitute or whether he just does the live sex shows. I'm not sure. But then the police show up and they say, "Hey, look, we need to arrest somebody. We need to bring them in because there's been a murder. And don't worry, like it's all just for show. We just want to bring someone in, and we'll question them, and then after a while we'll let them go, and it'll just make it look like we're doing our job or whatever, And so the guy who runs the place says, "Sure, take Sweetback," and so Sweetback goes with him. And then on the way to the station, they come across some sort of a riot or something that's happening, and they arrest, I guess, a Black Panther, and they start to really kind of abuse him and beat him. And so Sweetback decides he's going to get involved, and he basically beats the cops. And he doesn't kill them, though, because we find out they're in the hospital later, but he beats the cops really badly and takes off. And from that point on, he's kind of on the run. And now the police are after him, and he spends the rest of the movie on the run. Does that about sum it up? Does that make sense?
I don't know why you're wasting your time explaining it. It's not about the plot or the story, but yes, that kind of sums it up. Black Panthers had a lot to do with the messaging in the film. I think a lot of the early films were inspired or work in concert with the message of Black Panthers, with community and things like that. I think Superfly kind of broke away from that because it was more like, all right, like it's difficult, blacks and whites working together, but you know, it's more like communism rather than socialism. But there's a lot of this Black Panther stuff. So there are messages in the movie, but I mean, come on. It's an art house film. I don't think we need to go over the plot too much because, again, it's just all a vessel for him to say the things he wants to say in a non-narrative structure. Because, I mean, if he was great at doing narrative stories, his filmography clearly doesn't show it. I think this was lightning in a bottle. This was a guy who was at the right time, right place, went all in, you know, said, fuck it, I'm gambling everything on 6 and craps, and it came up 6 or whatever the number is that comes up with craps, and he lucked out. But I don't think he's a great filmmaker by any stance, because the rest of his filmography wasn't really much there. And I think artistically there's a lot of great experimental things, but I think it's more of like a really good accomplishment in an art house film. But I don't think it's great on its own, and I don't think there's much of a story or plot. It's just like, all right, this is going to get the ball rolling. We're going to touch base on all these different things I want to touch base on. I'm going to have sex with a lot of women. We're going to get religion in there. We're going to get all our messaging in there about blacks and whites and police brutality, corruption. We're going to get into like masculinity and the envy of the black man's penis. He's this stud and they're picking on him because of jealousy and things like that. So I think like he had ideas and thoughts and he got it all out. But I don't think the film itself is worth deep analyzing. I think we gave a good picture of what the film is about and why it's important.
Yes, absolutely. And the interesting thing too about it, even though it was a huge, huge success, it did not lead to any sequels, and it did not lead to any remakes.
Because of everything we just said.
How could you do it, right?
It's lightning in a bottle. You don't catch lightning in a bottle twice.
No. And I mean, how could you even, like, if you wanted to make a sequel, although in a way it almost seems like the film is setting itself up for a sequel, because at the end it says something like he's coming back and he's going to collect some dues or something along those lines. So it almost feels like, oh, he's coming back, you know, there's going to be another. But yeah, I don't know how you would ever do another one. I don't know how.
There's a reason he didn't make another one.
Yeah. It would just be I think it would be a mistake to try and either make a sequel.
It's good that he didn't. It's one thing making bad sequels to Shaft and bad sequels to Superfly, but this is a movie that should have stood on its own, and I'm glad it did stand on its own, because again, it's not something that spawns a franchise. It's just something that's right time, right place, right messaging, and it was historic, and it should be remembered, and it should be watched, but not for pure entertainment standpoint. You know, right. It's more so like it's almost like going to a museum rather than, you know, going to like a ball game or a concert. You know, it's like, all right, this is part entertainment, but it's also part education, part cultural, part understanding of what was going on at the time and why this is important, rather than, oh man, like I can't wait to see, big explosions or like plot twists and things like, no, you're not watching this for any of those type of reasons. If you want that, watch like Blackula or Shaft or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
But those are my thoughts on it. Any final thoughts before we wrap up on Shaft or Blaxploitation, or I'm sorry, Sweetback or Blaxploitation in general?
No, I think just what we've kind of said already, which is these are movies that are worth watching, and people should definitely give them a chance. I would also recommend, as a companion piece to Sweetback's Badass Song, try taking a look at Badass, the Mario Van Peebles movie about the making of it, because that really, to me, that's part of what makes it interesting, is how they made it and all the stories that go on behind the scenes of this film. But yeah, basically, I think people should check these movies out, and they should check out other movies like the ones on your top 10 list. And yeah, I think it's a genre or a style or whatever it is, a movement that is definitely worth exploring. And there's a lot to enjoy there. And there's also a lot to learn from that, I think, as well. I do have one more thing to say on the subject of Blaxploitation.
Sure, I'm still recording. Go ahead.
Blaxploitation directors. When you suggested that we should do a Blaxploitation director,
you're right. This guy Mac Flanagan is more recent. But go ahead.
Oh, okay, yeah. So when you suggested doing a Blaxploitation director, I thought of a few people right away, and then I thought, well, there must be other guys. So I did a Google search to see if I could come up with. So I searched for Blaxploitation directors, and there was a Wikipedia page that came up, which lists Blaxploitation film directors, and they only list 12. They have 12 on this page, but so it's by no means exhaustive. It doesn't have everybody, but guess who is number 12 on the list here? The last person on the list.
You're not going to say me, are you?
I am.
Oh, really?
Can you see that? Can you see that?
No, I can't see. You got to put it more towards your face. I can't see it.
Over here?
W for Sean Weathers. Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I was like, oh my God. So we could have been talking about your filmography instead.
There you go. Because Hookers in Revolt did pretty well. So it does make a few lists if you Google around for it. So
cool.
It must be a really short list if I'm on there.
Well, it's 12 people.
Oh man, that's funny.
Yeah. So yeah, there you go. You are on this prestigious list of Blaxploitation film directors.
I barely made the cut, huh? Thank God I didn't stop hitting record. I can squeeze this in there.
Yeah, excellent.